All right. Good morning, everyone. My name's Dan. I am an account executive with eGroup, and just wanted to say thanks for joining us today as I talk us through the fiscal year 21 Microsoft Cloud Incentive Programs. The Microsoft Cloud Incentive Programs, pretty excited to talk about them personally, just because they've been a tool that I've been able to leverage for my customers and help really move projects along and help dive into Microsoft engagements. So we're going to talk a little bit today just about what they are, how to access them, and what eGroup can do to help you out there. Throughout this time, we do have a question and answer box. I might not have all the answers for the questions that pop in today, but please, anything that comes to mind, drop that in the box. If I can't answer it today, we'll follow up with you with an answer related to that. Really, the goal today is to get as much info out there in general terms, but if we can make it specific to anything that you have, and thank you for your time, please do so. So let's kind of kick this off. Like I mentioned, the kind of goal for today is really just how can we leverage these programs to better advance our Microsoft objectives. So whether it's a cloud transformation, whether it's how to increase productivity across the end user community, we're really going to make sure that we touch on the different programs that you can access and how we'll help you get there. Before we do that, we'll kind of kick off with a brief intro to eGroup and our relationship with Microsoft and talk through that for those of you that haven't engaged with us before. I will also be sharing some outcomes that we've had with current customers. Some of them will be from colleagues of mine that have used this program to help out, and then I've got a few stories to share from some of my personal engagements that we can talk through. And then we'll actually dive into the specifics of each program. They've got some tailored to Azure, they've got some tailored to Modern Workplace, and we'll kind of talk through the qualifications and what some of those engagements will look like. And then ultimately at the end, right, how to get started on something like this, it really does boil down to, reach out to eGroup or reach out to your Microsoft rep. So again, encourage the question asking, and we'll kind of tell you what more formally you can do towards the end if there are additional questions. So a little bit about eGroup. We are a Microsoft Gold national solution provider, and we serve over 300 entities across the nation. We're in more than 26 states at this point. And we have a lot of customers that kind of take us on their travels with them. So we do have an international presence based on our customers' needs and helping them accomplish goals across the world. So, as a company, we're headquartered out of Charleston, South Carolina. As you can see, the little gold star down there. Roughly about 45 employees. We're a privately owned organization that's been around for about 20 years. And as you'll hopefully hear today, Microsoft has been a huge part of that. We focus on other parts of the data center and cloud strategy as well. And you'll hear a bit of that touched on as we go through the different programs, as we weave these into different tools for you to use. So, I think what's more important about kind of who we are and where we are is who our customers are. And I like this slide. Everybody's got a slide similar to this, but I'll talk through why it's important and kind of how it applies to today. A lot of these organizations, they're in legal, healthcare, financial, they're high end in the sense of compliance, in the sense of attention to detail and what their end users demand. Data protection, governance, security, these are all very important things, especially in legal industry, especially in healthcare, especially in finance. And so we work across all these different entities to help deliver these robust platforms to enable them to move forward with confidence. And we do that through these funded engagements. And I'll highlight some examples with some logos that you see today. And I always like to call out one in particular, right? As far as kind of how eGroup operates, we have a partnership with a group called Central Square, and in terms of our ability to deliver resiliency and availability, Central Square and eGroup partnered together to deliver modernized 911 systems across the country. So, in terms of experience and understanding whether it's critical or not, we have a lot on our staff, on our team that have experience in those data centers and setting up 911 call centers. So we really understand kind of the life or death scenario, but we also can take that mentality and apply it to different groups and really make sure that we're building bulletproof systems that you understand and that are easy to manage, that allow you to focus on the important things in your organization. So that really is kind of the high level on eGroup. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A there, and we're happy to help out. We've also got a great website you can check out with a lot of content as well. So now I kind of want to, before talking too much in detail about the actual programs, I wanted to just share some success stories that we've had with various customers, different types of customers. We pulled out the identifying details, but really it's the projects that we engaged on that I think translate into other organizations, and hopefully you'll be able to see where this might align with you, or maybe with a few variations, this is something that maybe your group could leverage. So first three that we've got here, kind of walk through the scenarios and what we walked into, how we got through it, and what the outcome was. So Modern Workplace, and this is kind of the comprehensive suite of the Microsoft products. So for those of you that aren't familiar, it covers your Intune, your Windows 10. It's kind of that portfolio of products that Microsoft is pushing us towards and looking to expand across your business. And in this one in particular, I call it because it was an interesting scenario in that we were brought in to work with a group that was G Suite for probably 900 to 1,000 users. There were a lot more external users, but through and through, this organization was G Suite for all their needs. And they gave the opportunity, right, to Microsoft. Let's talk about, why would we get off of G Suite? Why wouldn't we stay on what's working, and why would we consider something like Microsoft 365, right? And the way that we approach this, even as a Microsoft partner, we still want to approach this from an educational perspective. We were able to secure some initial funding that allowed us to just do sort of an assessment and a workshop around the fundamentals of Azure, but also the implementation of Microsoft 365 and how that could roll out in addition to what they already have. And we kind of made a comparison and checked off what they had in G Suite and what we have available in Microsoft 365 and walked through the different comparisons. And hey, this is what that migration to the Microsoft 365 might look like. But maybe you're functioning at a higher level within a G Suite program here, and really being able to understand where they come from and line that up with the Modern Workplace suite, that really allowed us to have a very informative workshop. So that actually, when this organization came to acquire another group, they did some discovery. And typically, when you get acquired, you're kind of giving up ownership, right? You're saying, all right, we're going to get absorbed into a larger group, and we're going to adapt their technology methods because it's just typically how these things work out. But the smaller group actually had a very well thought out Microsoft 365 design that the group that we initially worked with was able to kind of see and connect that to the workshop that they had, and made the decision to then actually move off of G Suite and roll out Modern Workplace so that they could streamline some of the best practices that they observed with this other company that they were acquiring and integrate that into the large workforce. So fairly quickly, we're actually able to roll out and deploy 900 or so users on Modern Workplace, get them up to stuff on Teams, Exchange, being able to access Azure AD Premium for the internal team. It really enabled them to move quickly because we took the time to sit down and dig through the details and make the comparisons and actually talk about those paths from point A to point B. And that way they had that in mind when they encountered a scenario where it actually made sense. And so really the idea of the workshop is to help develop those ideas and help give you that foundation that, sure, your team could find it. You could go out and find that info, but if you can condense it and get it delivered in a finer form factor, you can move a little bit faster there. And after the fact, we were able to secure an additional amount of funding to actually help with that deployment. So that first story, it's a bit longer than some of the other ones that we'll talk through today, but it was really interesting because migrating from G Suite to Microsoft, dealing with mergers and acquisitions, those are typically things that are messy, that we kind of brace ourselves for when we enter into that. But when you come equipped with the knowledge that's delivered in one of these workshops and you can take that and apply it to a real life business scenario, it really does make those projects a lot easier. And that's what we wanted to highlight there, was just kind of that simple workshop with a few $1,000s in funding, set the stage for a much more successful project that we could implement quickly and also leverage more funding to help subsidize those costs. So that's a big one on Modern Workplace. If there's any questions around that, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll actually talk on kind of some of the requirements there. Windows Virtual Desktop, this is another one. You can't spell COVID without VDI, and that's really cheesy, and I did come up with that just now, but it really is. VDI has been huge on the radar for the past 3 to 6 months because of where we're at currently, but also just in general, it's been a concept that a lot of groups are looking to discover as they redefine what remote work is, as they redefine how the end users access their applications and their infrastructure. It's always been a topic, and so Windows is actually, the Virtual Desktop program has a great program that's been in place for a number of years where we're able to get funding to do proof of concepts around a potential VDI environment. And so for this particular example, the group already had an instance of Azure deployed. And so right away, the kind of natural path to let's expand upon what we're currently using, something we're familiar with, made sense. But Windows Virtual Desktop came into play as a tool that they were heavily evaluating because it did require Azure to work. That was why we also identified Azure as the platform. But more importantly was the ability to also hook in the NetApp file capability within Azure and mimic high performance filer capabilities in the Windows Virtual Desktop environment. And so the end user experience, we were able to map out and design and try to take what they were used to and shift that into a more efficient model. The efficiencies of VDI being it's on when you need it to be, it's off when you don't need it to be. It can scale up at the click of a mouse, it can pull back down. How do we make sure that that experience translates into a more efficient operational model? And so really what we were able to do is get just under $20,000 in funding to design it, configure it, deploy it, and test it. And we were able to get the initial sample set of users out in that first week after going through the paces of kind of digging in and coming up with a game plan. So we'll touch a little bit more on VDI, but like in the case of Windows Virtual Desktop, there are a lot of great programs out there to evaluate that. And eGroup on our side, we can always help with the Azure platform, looking at Windows Virtual Desktop, but also other VDI options out there. The last example on this slide, and this one, right, it's pretty broad, right? There's a lot of process automation and automation that gets tossed about, but when it comes down specifically to what we can do with Microsoft, it's about taking all the tools that are within the Microsoft portfolio and leveraging essentially what you already have or what you might have easier access to, and unifying those to eliminate things like paper processes. So how do we go to e-signature and verifying documents online where we might have been doing that in the past in different methods? And especially now we're in a remote world, right? How do we automate and how do we make sure that these processes still align with the way that we conduct ourselves today? And that is really the biggest piece of business process automation. And this gets into really all sorts of areas within Microsoft. We can do processes around just Microsoft Teams. We can take this beyond and get into the Power Platform and look at how we can connect the dots across the different tools and software that you have already and integrate those on the back end with that platform. Using SharePoint Online and making sure that that is something that is easy. It's not something that, we ban that from our conversations internally. SharePoint's a bad word. We want to make sure that we help your organizations have success with those tools should they choose to pursue that. So with this one in particular, I mentioned the paperless. We were able to secure $34,000 in funding to develop a proof of concept around the development of these processes and pulling in some of our eGroup technical resources, testing those before making them go live for the company. And so again, this is a really popular area to focus on as we navigate the kind of the new way that work is done, and especially as these tools develop, how do we continue to integrate them and make the end user experience that much more easy, but also have that much more control on it. A few more areas that I'll touch on, and these kind of tie into other areas beyond just kind of Microsoft, right? And what we'd like to do is incorporate these joint solutions because they're tried, they're tested, we've been able to have success with them, and they're validated with the vendors. And so when you have all parties at the table kind of coming together for a joint solution, it really brings a much more powerful effect to the table when it comes to the results that you're trying to secure. So we do a backup assessment, a cloud backup assessment. And with this being a Microsoft funded engagement, right, the cloud, and I'll give you a few guesses, but typically the cloud's Azure, it's always Azure. We look at how Azure plays a role in business continuity. And so the example we have here is the client was simply looking to get rid of tape. They had lots of data, 150 terabytes of data. They had SLAs that were more built to the backup solution than they were to the needs of the organization. And we were looking at a way to modernize the backup solution, but also get rid of tape. And with cloud, you can achieve that cheap, deep storage, the archive, and still have that functionality where it's accessible in a bit different way than you can with tape. Tape certainly has the cheap and deep down as well, but being able to have that access and being able to have something like your backup solution recognize it and pull those files back out of archive, that's what we want to explore with cloud backup assessment. Because we're taking a look at the cost of storage, we're taking a look at that time between the request and when that comes back. And that's an important piece of the cloud backup assessment. And especially in this case, we wanted to find a way to take a solution. In this case, it was Rubrik, a kind of modernized all-in-one backup solution that also does data management. We were able to get some funding to evaluate the existing EMC data protection solution. We took a look at kind of what that looked like. And if that could do the cloud connection, if that was an EMC to Azure connection that we could do. And certainly that is the case in a lot of instances. A lot of backup solutions have the ability to hook into Azure, and we might simply leave the explanation and the exploration at that. Here's how Azure will hook into what you have today. But in this case, there were other areas around just the SLAs that I mentioned, around being immutable from ransomware. We wanted to make sure that we also addressed some desires around revamping the backup solution. And so with Rubrik and Azure, who have kind of a defined relationship and have a lot of integrations together, we're able to come in, design out this whole solution, design the actual migration from the old software, from the old solution to the new one, and then also help with that setup around Azure and getting it configured properly and helping set those policies there. And so now the new solution is a modernized backup solution. It cut the time in maybe, a fourth of what needed to be done previously, but it's also much more efficiently leveraging Azure for that offsite storage and allowing them to have less on-premises and leverage more smart intelligent storage offsite for the archive. And we use Azure funding to go through that, right? Similar to that is where we focus on IT resilience. And I call out a tool called Zerto. It's really, if you're familiar with like VMware Site Recovery Manager, SRM, Zerto is really the next iteration, and it has a great pairing with Azure that we've done for a lot of our customers, where we look at the disaster recovery scenario. How do we leverage Azure in a DR scenario? And I've heard some people say, right, if we're planning for a DR, you don't buy a second house in case your first house catches on fire. You kind of have maybe a thought of where you want to go or a place to go, but it wouldn't necessarily make sense to have two houses. So with the Zerto to Azure, we've helped a lot of customers, and in this particular example, reduce the need for that second house. I've got maybe 60 out of 200 machines that are critical. I've got a data center spun up. It's like for like, but we're trying to cut costs. We want to get out of that data center. And I understand that Azure probably has 16 times the level of resiliency built in across the data centers than maybe what I have at my offsite right now. So we want to explore that. And so we similar to the backup process, get the funding, do the design, understand where you're currently at, and then map that out from a DR perspective. Can I go live in Azure? How much does that cost? What's that process to do that? And what's that process to get back? And we want to explore the costs around kind of those worst case scenarios where you do have to engage, you do have to pull that trigger and map that out and make sure that it works, because your backups, your DR, it's only good if it works. And you ask yourself, do we test DR? You know if you're telling yourself the truth, in regard to that. So part of this engagement with IT resilience is really to be able to leverage the Microsoft funding to get a deep dive into Azure and its role within this engagement, and then pull in tools like Zerto or what you're using for DR and make sure that you have a full understanding of this, and then also kind of a map to go live with it. And so that's where we'll see it kind of on the disaster recovery side. So you can take Microsoft funding and apply it to business continuity, disaster recovery. We're kind of getting out of just, hey, I want infrastructure as a service, I want something on Azure. We can really branch out with this. And then one more to kind of give you a sense of the scale, right? And this is a program that I'll talk about towards the end. It falls under an ESIF category that we'll talk about. But this was a large organization, a state organization. They just bought a bunch of licensing. And the idea behind buying a lot of licensing is that you're going to roll it all out and it's going to go well and you know everything you're doing. But we all know that that never really translates. So part of what we were brought in to do was to set up a series of workshops, to set up a series of proof of concepts. Let's take a look at this massive software suite that you just invested in, that you spent the time to evaluate and roll out and made the decision to consciously go after. Let's find the quick wins. Let's get some of this Microsoft money. Let's put some workshops around the different, maybe you got new features like Intune or something like that in the license. Let's identify the areas where we want to increase our knowledge of how they work. Let's do some workshops around them. Then let's identify how can we maybe do some quick wins. Can we get some stuff deployed? Can we look at other vendors that we have for third-party functions and eliminate those expenses? Can we get rid of other software line items by fully understanding the investments we've made in our Microsoft platform? And so this one I like to highlight because we did get $100,000 in funding from Microsoft, and that's a lot of work. And it's when you come to the table knowing what you want, when you have an idea of where the organization needs to go, it's very powerful in terms of this program because it gives you a lot of access to different programs, methodologies, and resources to help maximize the rollout of that investment. And so with this one, we spent a lot of time on various kind of in the weed stuff. I'll call out Intune specifically, ATP Endpoint Manager. We had multiple hour sessions on just these things alone. But when you're dealing with 10, 15, 20, 30,000 end users, it requires a lot of thought. It requires a lot of evaluation of where you're at currently, how we want to get to that point, what is that going to impact as we get there, and then what does that success look like after the fact. And so with this one, we got a significant amount of funding to really dig into just about every piece of the E5 licensing for this organization. So even when it comes to just better understanding what you bought or better deploying what you have, there are certainly opportunities here as well to really get into it. So those were really just kind of the top of the stack, I guess, in terms of examples that we have. If you have any questions on those, or if you have any thoughts that are starting to develop around, hey, maybe we could do something like this, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. Happy to take any questions on that. So now it's kind of like, how does this work, right? What is behind the curtain? And you got the sales guy on screen talking about all this free money. Like, how does this actually work? What's the catch? So as we've mentioned, it's programmatic. There are different buckets of funding that Microsoft provides, and typically they are in line with the fiscal year, right? And as buckets of funding goes, they're finite, but really it's about coming to that table with an idea, having that conversation, and understanding where you want it to go. The first one, Microsoft Azure Everywhere. This program is probably the most widely available in terms of who can access it. And I'll explain the difference here between unmanaged, managed, public sector. There's some Microsoft terms that you may or may not be familiar with and where you fit. But the idea behind Azure Everywhere is we understand there's some major cloud providers out there, AWS, Azure, Google, and what this is really about is making sure that you get Azure done right. There's a lot of opportunity to dig in and really explore different use cases for Azure through this funding. And so everybody gets access to a workshop, and then there's also access to an adopt or manage activity that can come after the fact. Excuse me. So the idea behind this is, are you starting to investigate Azure and have a use case that you want to test out? Or are you in Azure and you want to do some cleanup? You want to expand that. You want to maybe introduce other elements within that portfolio and grow those for your use case. That is where this will typically allow us to access funding. So really, again, Azure Everywhere, if you've got something related to that, and I'll talk through some examples on the right, this is what we'd want to look at. As to who is an unmanaged customer, who's a select managed customer, public sector customers, all unmanaged customers, this is open to just about everybody, provided that you are not already taking advantage of, I believe, the charity or nonprofit licensing. Select managed customers are groups that have an account exec. So if you have a dedicated Microsoft account team, you have Azure specialists, you have the actual account exec, you would fall under what they call their SMC, or select managed customer. And so you do have access to funding in this case. The unmanaged customer, if you're not on that list, it just goes through a separate process, but typically we get the same results. We put together the business case with you, we submit, and we get the funding shortly after. And then also public sector customers, so state, local orgs, if you are looking to test out different ways to explore cloud, sometimes funding can be quite hard to come by. So we could do a workshop today, and in 6 months down the road, you can take that information and then apply for budget down the road. So there's a lot of different groups that we can work with the Azure Everywhere specifically. Examples that I didn't touch on in previous slides, so we talked a little bit about cloud architecture and design, and really just kind of getting Azure done right. We want to make sure that if this is kind of your first foray into Azure, let's go through the workshops. Let's kind of learn the lingo. Let's make sure that we understand the tools and the buttons that we have at our disposal, and make sure that it goes well. I think everybody wants things like that to go well. We talk a bit about hybrid data protection and disaster recovery. Those, again, directly related to Azure, we can certainly come together and take a look at your backup solution in Azure. We can take a look at new backup solutions in Azure. We can talk about disaster recovery. That is a pain in the butt for most groups, right? Backups are backups, and they're really not something you want to be thinking about on a day-to-day basis. But when done right, it's you're sleeping a little bit better at night. So we do a lot in Azure funding related to that because people are exploring where cloud fits there. Virtual desktops, I did mention Windows Virtual Desktop, but because you can put things like Nutanix Frame, VMware Horizon, Citrix, you can put all of this on Azure. We do want to take a vendor agnostic approach. We want to help you understand how Azure can create the platform for your virtual desktop evaluation. And so we'll do that. If you look back in some of our older webinar series, we do have like a virtual battle panel across 4 different VDI solutions. So we can even leverage it for something like that. File shares is another one that a lot of people don't necessarily think about, but an example is a legal customer that had about 20 terabytes of file data, and they wanted to get it offsite. They wanted it in that cheap and deep storage. And so we helped them set up that migration to the Azure file share, but also, again, mimicking the performance that they would need in order to pull that back. Now, getting it offsite, it might be a few seconds longer than if they had it locally, but the cost on that is far greater. I don't know if my screen's doing that in front of everybody else. The next one here is the Microsoft 365 Everywhere. And this one is where we take a look at your Office 365, what you kind of knew as O365. We take a look at security, Windows 10, everything that kind of falls within that. That's what we talk about when we mention Microsoft 365 Everywhere. And so these are actually only available to managed customers and public sector customers that are not on a cloud solutions provider agreement. So if you have any questions about that, again, hey, am I a managed customer or not? That's a quick reach out to eGroup and we can find that out for you. But generally, if you have an account exec, you're managed. If not, you're not. We can always help with that. These workshops will, it can be a one day, hey, what did I buy? Let's walk through OneDrive specifically, or let's unwrap Teams and really dig into best practice around data and governance. We can do a simple one-day workshop there. Although those typically set the stage for, all right, I understand this a bit more clearly now. Let's get into road mapping and building out kind of a plan for how we actually roll these out. How do I get my end users to embrace Teams and voice? I've had them dialing off a handset for ages. How do I influence company culture and get them to adopt Teams, do best practice, and make our lives a little easier as we roll out the technology that ultimately will save us money in the long run. We want to make sure that we spend a lot of time there. Data and governance, especially around Teams, voice, and any of these newer collaboration tools is really big for groups that have gone fully remote. And then really, if we want to extend it out and look at large buckets of funding, how do we actually roll this out? Let's do a proof of concept. Let's take 100 of 1,000 users and let's do it with you. Let's make that a part of this engagement. Let's get some funding for it. Typically at this point, we're looking at, all right, now there's a little skin in the game on your end, but Microsoft funding has gotten us through some deep dives, some learning, some education, some design, and even potentially some testing. Now we just have to roll out something that we've put a lot of thought into, we put a lot of time into, but we didn't put a lot of money into. And when you have all that behind it, it makes that a much more cost-efficient project when it comes to that rollout. So some examples that we talked about, the migrations from G Suite over to Exchange, OneDrive, being able to migrate to those processes, identity, in all regards, we've got everybody working from home, accessing devices, sharing. There's just, how do we set up as many ways to kind of vet our end users and get zero trust? How do we leverage Microsoft 365 and the tools available to get zero trust and to do that efficiently? These are all areas where we can find funding. So if you're thinking about making that move to Teams, if you're thinking about how do I more secure the end user environment, these are all areas that we can take and go to Microsoft and put together some plans and look to get some funding on. And I know we're getting close to the bottom of the hour. So my last, skip real quick. The last program here in this, the last two programs, the Azure Everywhere and Microsoft 365 Everywhere, those are a bit more, I wouldn't call them rigid because as I mentioned, they've got a lot more flexibility, but when it comes down to the true most flexible program, what we call ESIF or End Customer Incentive Funds, this is for managed customers only, and it's a case-by-case basis because it typically involves working with the account team. Microsoft has groups like Fast Track that can work in conjunction with eGroup, but we leverage ESIF funding for various projects that might go beyond the scope of just backup to Azure. The $100,000 example that we used prior in this presentation, that was an ESIF engagement because it encompassed many different areas of modern workplace. It really hit on different notes. It involved many proof of concepts. And so when you start looking at the complexity, ESIF is just simply the program that we use to get a more flexible approach. And with that, it's got a bit more of a stringent request in terms of what we put forward, but it's really used for big adoptions. It's used for big education and rollout initiatives. And it really allows you to get a broader scope with the Microsoft resources kind of side by side with eGroup in terms of what you're going to be able to do. So that is the final program there. And as you can see on the right side, there's some examples around just different adoption and implementation capabilities that we do. But really ESIF is for when it doesn't quite fit into Azure Everywhere or Modern Workplace, and you're a managed customer, we can tap into the ESIF bucket and look to that for some funding. So with that being said, that is kind of a high-level overview of the Microsoft incentive programs. We've got the Azure Everywhere, we've got the Modern Workplace, we've got ESIF, and really tried to cover a lot of different areas that funding is applicable. If you have questions, if you think that maybe we touched on something that might have lined up with a thought that you had, ask us. I mean, really, it's as simple as we'll look into it if you can get that funding, and if we can put something together, it's a pretty quick process. So I did want to call out that Leanne Thomas from our side, she's the lead on business development here at eGroup. She'll be following up with everybody with a recording. I'll leave this up for just a minute or so if there are any actual questions, but look out for that note from Leanne. If you want to set up a call, she'll be the person to get you connected to the right people, and even kick back questions that you might have to Leanne, and we can chase that down for you. So with that being said, again, I appreciate the time. Those of you that have been attending, thank you for the continued support on these. If this is your first chance to check out eGroup, appreciate it. This is a great way to try out eGroup as a potential partner with Microsoft funding, and we'd be happy to do that with you. So again, my name's Dan with eGroup, and thanks for your time today.